Snow fell hard that December night, as Vittorio Caruso stepped out of his black Bentley in the darkest corner of Brooklyn. He wasn't here for charity. He was hunting a traitor, Marco Benedetti, the man who had sold information to the Morettis and cost the Caruso family 3 warehouses and 2 good men. But what stopped the most feared man in New York wasn't the bitter cold or the empty streets. It was a woman sitting alone on the frozen sidewalk, clutching a Neapolitan Mastiff wrapped in a threadbare blanket. A cardboard sign hung from the dog's neck. "Please buy my dog. I need money to pay my father's debt." Vittorio's eyes didn't go to the woman first. They went to the dog. Something about the beast felt familiar, the way it sat perfectly still. Muscles coiled, eyes tracking every movement like a predator waiting to strike. This wasn't a pet. This was a weapon. When the Mafia boss approached, the woman looked up. Her green eyes were red and hollow from crying. "Sir, will you buy my dog?" she whispered. "Please, I have no one else to ask." Vittorio studied her face with cold indifference. "Why are you selling him?" "My father," she swallowed hard. "He's dying, and I don't have any money to save him." Vittorio said nothing. He didn't care about dying fathers or desperate women. But that dog, those eyes, he had seen them before, 20 years ago, in a dark alley, when death had come for him. What happened next changed everything. Before we dive in, smash that like button if you love stories like this. Share it with someone who needs a good cry tonight. And if you haven't already, subscribe, you don't want to miss what happens next. Vittorio didn't kneel the way a kind man would. He stood rigid in the curtain of white snow, looking down at the woman huddled at his feet with eyes as cold as steel. The snow gathered on his shoulders, ignored, as his focus remained locked on the girl. His mind was churning with distant memories, incomplete fragments of a dark night 20 years ago. When he spoke, his voice was sharp, stripped of feeling. "Who does your father owe?" Rosalie lifted her head. Her eyes, raw from crying, now brimmed with fear. She hadn't expected a question like that from a stranger. I don't know exactly." She swallowed, fighting to keep her voice from trembling. "They said my father used to work for them, and he left before he finished the contract." Vittorio's brow tightened slightly. Contract. The word rang in his skull like an alarm bell. This wasn't the language of ordinary people. It was the language of the underworld, of those who lived in the shadows, of men like him. He pressed on, his tone like an interrogation. "What did your father do?" Rosalie shook her head, her narrow shoulders shivering from the cold and from fear. "I don't know. He never told me." Her gaze dropped to Phantom, her hand, purple with the bite of the weather, still resting on the dog's back as if it were the only steady thing left to hold. "My father only said he'd walked away from his old life to raise me. He said his past didn't matter. Only my future mattered." Vittorio said nothing. His eyes moved from Rosalie to the dog, studying it more closely than before. Phantom sat upright like a statue, ears pricked, glossy black eyes never leaving Vittorio for a single second. Muscle lay taut beneath the dog's black-gray coat, ready to explode at any moment. Vittorio noticed an old scar on its left ear, the mark of a fighter that had battled and survived. Inside, he was breaking down every detail. This dog had been trained, not the usual training for pets or service dogs. This was a combat dog, the kind conditioned to protect, to attack, to kill if necessary. Only people from the underworld kept animals like this. Rosalie seemed to notice Vittorio's attention on Phantom. She added, her voice shaking. "My father said Phantom was the only friend he had left from his old life. Phantom has been our only family for 5 years. My father raised him from a pup to be my protector. 5 years." Vittorio calculated in silence. Too young to be the beast from 20 years ago. But the eyes, the stance. This had to be the bloodline of the legend. He shoved the thought aside and asked the final question, his voice as sharp as a blade. "What's your father's name?" Rosalie hesitated. She looked into Vittorio's gray eyes and felt an invisible fear clamp around her heart. This man wasn't like anyone she'd ever met. His gaze was cold, empty, as if he could kill without blinking. But she had no choice. She needed money. Her father had to be saved. "Enzo," she whispered, so softly the wind and snow almost swallowed it. "Enzo Brennan." On the outside, Vittorio didn't move. His face stayed frozen, not a single muscle twitching, not a flicker of expression breaking through. But inside, it was like lightning struck him. Enzo Brennan, the ghost, the legendary assassin of the Caruso family, the man who had stepped into the shadows nearly 3 decades ago, only surfacing once to save a boy in an alley 20 years ago, taking with him an unfinished contract and a loyalty turned into betrayal, and the same man who had saved Vittorio's life in that dark alley. Vittorio looked at Rosalie again, and something in his gaze shifted. She knew nothing. It was obvious. She didn't know who her father was, didn't know what he'd done, didn't know how many lives had ended under the hand of the man she called Dad. She was only a desperate girl trying to save her father. Behind them, footsteps crunched over snow. Sal came up, voice low and urgent. "Boss, we've still got business to handle. Marco can't wait forever." Vittorio didn't answer. He didn't turn around. His eyes stayed locked on Phantom, on the dog watching him with a warrior's caution. And in that moment, he knew tonight wouldn't end the way he'd planned. Vittorio's prolonged silence made the air feel more suffocating than ever. Snow kept falling without pause, settling on the shoulders of those standing there, as if it meant to bury them in the cold darkness. Tommy Gallo, the most hot-headed of the men who followed Vittorio, started to lose patience. He'd been standing here for nearly 10 minutes, watching his boss talk to a homeless girl and a filthy dog, while Marco Benedetti, that damned traitor, was still hiding somewhere in the city. Tommy stepped forward, his voice sharp with irritation. "Boss, we're wasting time. Marco's waiting to be dealt with. If he slips away tonight, we'll lose his trail." Vittorio didn't answer. He didn't even turn to look at Tommy. His eyes were still studying Phantom with a strange intensity Tommy had never seen in his boss. That only made Tommy angrier. He couldn't understand why a powerful man like Vittorio Caruso would stop for a dog and a girl nobody had ever heard of. Tommy misunderstood his boss's silence. He thought Vittorio was waiting for him to handle the problem, to clear the path so they could get back to work. That was what he'd done for years, cleaning away whatever got in the boss's way. Without another thought, Tommy strode toward Phantom and drove a hard kick into the dog's side. "Get out of here, Stray. Stop blocking the way." Rosalie screamed, horror ripping through her voice. "No, please don't." But she didn't get to finish. What happened next unfolded so fast no one had time to react. Phantom didn't growl a warning the way ordinary dogs would. There was no threatening bark, no defensive stance. In less than half a second, the dog became a black shadow, cutting through the snowfall. Tommy didn't even realize what was happening until he was flat on his back, his spine slamming into the frozen snow. His breath locked in his throat as he felt the brutal weight of the dog pinning his chest. And then he saw it. Phantom's fangs were only inches from his throat, the dog's hot breath washing over his face. Phantom's black eyes stared straight into Tommy's with a terrifying calm. Not the blind fury of an animal, but the precise calculation of a professional predator. Tommy lay perfectly still, eyes wide, not daring to breathe too hard. He could feel Phantom's teeth graze the skin of his neck. One more fraction of pressure and his carotid artery would be torn open, but Phantom didn't bite. The dog held that position, controlling Tommy completely, without leaving a single wound. This wasn't the reflex of an ordinary dog. This was the technique of a professional killer. Disable the target without killing. Total control without wasting energy. Sal reacted on instinct. His hand snapped the gun from its holster in a blink, aiming straight at Phantom's head. But before he could squeeze the trigger, Vittorio lifted a hand, signaling him to stop. No, a single word, cold and final. Sal froze, his finger still on the trigger but not daring to move. He looked at his boss in confusion, unable to understand why Vittorio was stopping him from saving Tommy. Rosalie ran forward, her voice breaking into a desperate shout. "Phantom. No, that's enough." And something like a miracle happened. Phantom instantly backed away, all four paws stepping back with fluid grace, then sat obediently beside Rosalie as if nothing had happened. The dog's tail gave a small wag, black eyes lifting to its owner with absolute devotion. From a terrifying killing machine, Phantom returned to a gentle dog in less than a second. Vittorio stood there, watching it all with eyes bright as a flame. He'd seen enough. He'd seen what he needed to see. This technique, he thought, while old memories spun violently in his mind. Only one man could have trained it. Only one dog could do it. 20 years ago, in that dark alley, he'd seen this exact method. A black blur lunging in, 5 enemies dropping, no one dead, but no one able to stand. That was the ghost's style. Disable, don't destroy. Control, don't slaughter. And the dog beside him that night was the ancestor of the beast sitting in front of Vittorio now. Tommy scrambled up, his face white as paper, his whole body shaking uncontrollably. He stared at Phantom like he'd just looked death in the eye. His coat was smeared with snow and mud, but he didn't bother brushing it off. He only wanted to get away from that dog as fast as possible. Vittorio turned to Tommy and Sal, his voice cold, empty of emotion. Back to the car. Wait for me. Both men looked at their boss with undisguised shock. In 10 years of serving Vittorio Caruso, they'd never seen him care about anyone but the job. Never seen him stop for a stranger. Never seen him let go of someone who'd attacked one of his men. But they didn't dare ask. No one questioned Vittorio Caruso. Tommy nodded and staggered toward the Bentley parked at the end of the street. Sal glanced at the boss one last time, then turned and followed, his hand still resting on the grip of his gun, wary and ready. That left only Vittorio, Rosalie, and Phantom in the whiteout of falling snow. Vittorio stood motionless in the falling snow, eyes fixed on Phantom. The dog sat there, composed, as if it hadn't just taken down a man 3 times its weight in less than a second. Vittorio studied the beast. It was the spitting image of the dog that had saved him 20 years ago, the same powerful frame, the same lethal instinct. This had to be its offspring, the successor of the legend that had once stood between him and death, 20 years ago. Vittorio was only 12 then, the young heir to a brutal empire, but still just a child. That night, the Moretti crew kidnapped him from his school. They dragged him into a dark alley in South Brooklyn. 5 men, all armed, towering over a terrified child like wolves around a lamb. Vittorio remembered the bitter cold. He thought he'd die before he even became a man, and then darkness exploded. A black shadow appeared out of nowhere, and with it a massive dog tore through the alley like a storm. 30 seconds. Only 30 seconds. All 5 enemies were on the ground, groaning in pain, but none of them dead. Vittorio stood there, shaking, watching the man step out of the shadows. Half his face was obscured, but his eyes burned in the night like the eyes of death. The man didn't say a word. He only looked at Vittorio with an ice-cold stare, as if weighing whether this kid was worth saving at all. Then he vanished, with his massive dog, dissolving into the darkness as if he'd never existed. That was the first and only time Vittorio had seen the ghost, the legendary assassin of the Caruso family, the man even his father treated with respect. Vittorio snapped back to the present, his breath spilling into the night as white clouds. He looked at Rosalie, truly looked at her for the first time since he'd stopped. Her eyes, the way the light caught in them, the fine but unyielding lines of her face, identical. She was identical to the man from that night, the ghost. Vittorio whispered, so quietly it was almost nothing, swallowed by wind and snow the moment it left his lips. Rosalie didn't hear him, but she felt the shift in the man's eyes. The cold, blank stare from before was now lit with something she couldn't read. Inside Vittorio's mind, a battle was raging. Enzo Brennan, the ghost, the #1 assassin of the Caruso family, the man who'd carried out dozens of contracts without ever failing, the man who'd built fear into every rival crew that crossed their path. He saved my life. Without that night, I would have died 20 years ago. I would have never become the boss. I would have had nothing. But he also ran, betrayed the organization, betrayed my father, vanished with an unfinished contract, leaving a stain on the Caruso family's history. By the law my father set, the law I swore to uphold, he has to die. There are no exceptions for traitors. Vittorio looked at Rosalie again. The girl was curled in on herself against the cold, lips purple, arms wrapped tight around Phantom as if the dog was the only thing keeping her from being carried off by the snowstorm. She knew nothing, completely innocent. She didn't know who her father was, didn't know what he'd done, didn't know the man standing in front of her had the power to end both their lives with a single nod. Vittorio made a decision, not the final decision, only the decision for tonight. He needed to see Enzo Brennan with his own eyes. He needed to know why the ghost had disappeared. He needed to understand why a legendary assassin had chosen to live in poverty with a daughter who knew nothing about his past. Take me to your father. Vittorio's voice cut through the snow, cold and impossible to refuse. Rosalie flinched, eyes widening with fear. She looked at the man in front of her, at the expensive suit, at the glossy black Bentley parked in the distance. at the two men waiting by the car with dangerous faces. She didn't know who he was, but she knew he wasn't ordinary. What? What are you going to do to him? Rosalie's voice trembled, threaded with fear and protection. My father is sick. He can't. Vittorio didn't answer. He only stood there, eyes on her with a terrifying patience, as if he could stand here all night until she agreed. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hiss of wind and the soft, relentless fall of snow. Rosalie looked down at Phantom, as if asking the dog what to do. Phantom only sat there, black eyes on Vittorio, unblinking, but showing no threat. It was the strangest thing Rosalie had ever seen. Phantom always growled at strangers, always put itself between her and anyone who came too close. But with this man, the dog was completely calm, as if it recognized something Rosalie couldn't see. At last, Vittorio spoke, his voice cold and final as a verdict. Go, right now. Rosalie stood up, her legs trembling from sitting too long on frozen ground. She looked at Vittorio one last time, trying to find any sign of his intention, but his face was carved from stone, giving away nothing at all. She had no choice. She knew that. This man, whoever he was, clearly wasn't the kind who accepted the word no. And if he truly wanted to find her father, he would, with or without her help. At least if she led the way, she could be beside her father when everything happened. Follow me. Rosalie said it softly, her voice rough from the cold and from crying too much. She started walking. Phantom rose at once and moved at her side, the dog's massive frame like a moving shield protecting its owner. Vittorio followed behind, eyes never stopping their watch. He noticed Phantom always kept itself between him and Rosalie, not close enough to be openly threatening, but close enough to react if he did anything to harm her. Even now, the dog was still doing its job. Behind them, the black Bentley rolled forward slowly, keeping a distance of several dozen yards. Sal was driving, obeying his boss's unspoken command. Vittorio knew his loyal man was wondering what was happening, why the boss was abandoning the hunt for Marco Benedetti to follow an unknown girl into the slums in the middle of a snowy night. But Sal wouldn't ask. He knew better than anyone that you didn't question Vittorio Caruso. They went deeper into the South Side, one of the poorest and most dangerous parts of Brooklyn. Vittorio watched the surroundings with the cold eyes of a man used to the city's darkest face. The houses along the street leaned and sagged, many abandoned, their shattered windows like empty eye sockets staring out at the road. Most of the streetlights were dead, leaving only a few weak bulbs throwing sickly yellow patches onto dirty snow. Trash piled up at the corners, stinking even in this skin-cutting cold. This was where the police didn't bother to patrol, where small gangs ruled, where the desperate came to die or to disappear. And this was where the ghost had chosen to hide for nearly 3 decades. Vittorio couldn't understand it. The ghost, an assassin paid millions for each contract, a man who once owned a Manhattan penthouse and a car collection worth a fortune, was living in a place like this. Enzo Brennan had earned enough during his years with the Caruso family to live in comfort for the rest of his life. So why was he here, in this slum, with a daughter who had to sell her dog to pay a debt? They stopped in front of a small house at the end of an alley, if it could even be called a house. It looked like it might collapse at any moment. A rusted tin roof, walls blotched with peeling plaster, windows covered with cardboard instead of glass. There was no light inside. The place sat in darkness like a forgotten grave. Rosalie halted at the door, her hand shaking as she reached for the key in her coat pocket. She turned back to Vittorio, and for the first time he saw shame in those eyes. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice on the edge of tears. "They shut off our electricity last week. I didn't have enough money to pay." Vittorio said nothing. He only stood there, waiting. Rosalie opened the door and stepped in, Phantom tight at her side. Vittorio crossed the threshold, and the cold inside hit him like a blow. Freezing, colder than outside, because outside there was still wind carrying some trace of warmth from somewhere in the city. But inside this house was a quiet, dead cold. No heat, no power, only a few candles set here and there on a table and shelves, giving off a thin, flickering light, enough to see, not enough to warm anything. Vittorio looked around the room. The furniture was old, worn, clearly passed through too many hands. A sofa with faded upholstery torn in places. A wooden table with legs patched together with wire. There was almost nothing of value left in this house, as if everything had been sold off piece by piece for cash. The air carried a faint smell of medicine and sickness, mixed with the damp rot of a home that hadn't been properly cared for. Then he saw the photograph, an old picture set on a wooden shelf near the window, framed carefully, perhaps the only thing in this house still kept with any real care. In it was a younger man, healthier, with black hair and bright eyes. He was holding a little girl, maybe 2 or 3 years old, with auburn hair and round cheeks. They were both smiling, a real happiness, not the stiff kind people put on for a camera. And sitting beside them was Phantom, younger, stronger, but with the same signature sharp black eyes. Vittorio stared at the photograph and recognized the man as the shadow from 20 years ago, but something was different. In this picture, Enzo Brennan wasn't the ghost, wasn't the infamous cold-blooded killer the whole underworld feared. He looked happy. He looked like an ordinary father, loving his daughter, savoring a simple life, nothing like the legend Vittorio had heard about for years. Vittorio stood there in a cashmere suit worth thousands, handmade leather shoes ordered from Italy, a Patek Philippe gleaming on his wrist, in a house with no heat and no electricity. The contrast was too stark, too cruel. He had everything Enzo Brennan didn't. Yet looking at that photograph, Vittorio found himself wondering whether Enzo had something he would never have. Is this the price of freedom? He asked himself in silence. Or is this the price of running? Or maybe this is the price of trying to be a good father while carrying sins that can't be washed away. Rosalie stopped at a wooden door at the end of the hallway, her hand on the knob but not turning it yet. She looked back at Vittorio, green eyes full of worry and fear. "My father is in here," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Please, he's very weak. Whatever you're going to do, please." She didn't finish, but Vittorio understood. He understood the fear of a child facing the possibility of losing a parent. He just didn't know whether he still had enough humanity left to care. Rosalie opened the door and stepped inside, Vittorio following behind her. The room was small and cramped, barely enough space for a single bed, an old wardrobe, and a wooden chair beside the mattress. A candle on the bedside table threw off a weak, unsteady light, just enough for Vittorio to see the man lying in the bed. And he almost didn't recognize him as the ghost. Enzo Brennan lay there, so thin his bones nearly showed beneath a pale, bluish skin. His cheeks were sunken deep, his lips dry and cracked, his hair almost entirely white, though he was only in his 50s. A handheld breathing machine sat beside the pillow, silent because its battery had died long ago. The man who once made the entire New York underworld tremble now looked like a skeleton wrapped in fragile skin, as if death had come knocking and was only waiting for him to answer. But the eyes, Enzo's eyes were still sharp as a blade, still the gaze of an assassin, of someone who had looked at death hundreds of times and never flinched. When Vittorio entered, those eyes opened, and for a brief moment Vittorio saw the spark of the warrior from years ago flare inside them. Their gazes met. Silence stretched for a few seconds, heavy as lead, thick as blood. Two men from two different generations, two sides of the same dark world, staring at each other through the flicker of candlelight. Enzo broke the silence first. His voice was weak, roughened by sickness, but it still held the astonishing calm of a man who had faced death too many times. "The kid in the alley," he said slowly, each word costing him effort, became the boss. Vittorio stood at the foot of the bed, looking down at the man who had once saved his life with an expression that gave nothing away, and the ghost became a walking corpse. Rosalie stood by her father's bed, eyes wide with confusion and fear. She looked back and forth between the two men, trying to understand what was happening. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "You know this man? Who is he?" Before Enzo could answer, Vittorio spoke, his voice cold as ice. "Get out." Rosalie turned to him, her eyes flashing with anger threaded through fear. "This is my home. This is my father. You don't have the right to order me around." Vittorio said nothing, only looked at her with that gaze, the gaze of a Mafia boss used to giving orders and being obeyed without explanation. Rosalie was about to say more, but Enzo's thin hand closed over hers, stopping her. "Go, sweetheart," Enzo said gently, his voice softer with his daughter. "I'm fine. Go outside. Let me talk to this guest." "But Dad," Rosalie wanted to argue, but when she looked into her father's eyes, she saw a determination she couldn't fight. She gave Vittorio one last look, wary and worried, then turned and stepped out. Phantom lay at the threshold, black eyes never leaving Vittorio for a second, ready to launch if he did anything to harm its master. When the door closed, only the two men remained in that narrow room filled with darkness and the smell of sickness. Vittorio didn't waste time. He wasn't the kind of man who liked ornament or pointless conversation. "You ran nearly 30 years ago," he said, voice like steel. "You didn't finish your last contract. Under Caruso law, the law my father set, you're a traitor." Enzo didn't look surprised. He simply lay there, watching Vittorio with a strangely calm gaze, as if he'd been waiting for this conversation for 12 years. "Yes," he said plainly. "No denial, no defense. I'm a traitor." Vittorio felt anger rise in him, sharp and hot, and he didn't fully understand it. Maybe it was Enzo's indifference. Maybe it was the fact he wasn't begging. Maybe it was that Vittorio hated standing here, torn between a debt of gratitude and the rules of his family. Traitors have to die. Vittorio said it slowly, each word clear as a sentence. No exceptions. That's the law. Enzo held Vittorio's stare without wavering, without fear. His body was so ruined he could barely move, but the spirit of the legendary killer remained intact. "Then why haven't you drawn your gun?" he asked, as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. "You came here to kill me, didn't you? So why am I still breathing?" Tense silence settled over the room. The candle on the bedside table flickered, and the shadows of the two men danced on the wall like ghosts from the past. Vittorio could hear Enzo's ragged breathing, the wind whistling outside the window, his own heart pounding hard in his chest. "Because you saved my life," Vittorio finally said, his voice no longer as cold as before, carrying something more complicated. "That night in the alley. If it hadn't been for you, I would have died." Enzo gave a small nod, as if he'd known the answer already. "Then we're even," he said. "I saved you. You let me live. Nobody owes anyone anything." "No," Vittorio shook his head, his voice snapping back into coldness. "Not even. You owe the organization a contract. You owed my father loyalty. That can't be erased with one life. That can't be erased by anything." Enzo tried to speak, but a violent coughing fit hit him without warning, tearing through his chest. He coughed and coughed, his thin body convulsing on the bed, his hand grabbing for the cloth on the bedside table and pressing it to his mouth. When it finally eased, Vittorio saw dark red streaks on the white fabric. Enzo panted, his face even paler than before, but his eyes stayed locked on Vittorio. "I know," he said, his voice raw after the coughing. "I know I deserve to die. I'm not asking for mercy. But before you deal with me, listen to me. Just once. Only once." Vittorio stood still, staring at the man who had once been a legend of the underworld, now barely clinging to life on a worn-out bed. He didn't speak. He only waited. Enzo drew in a deep breath, as if gathering the last scraps of strength left in his ruined body. Then he began to tell his story, voice weak and broken, every sentence costing him another piece of whatever life remained. 20 years ago, he said, eyes lifting to the ceiling as if he were looking into a far-off past. "Your father, Don Caruso, gave me my final contract. The target was an accountant named Richard Holloway. He'd embezzled nearly $2 million from the family and was planning to run to Europe." Enzo paused, coughing softly a few times before he continued. "The night I was going to do it, I got a call from Brooklyn Central Hospital. They said a woman named Elena had spoken my name before she died. She died giving birth." Enzo's voice trembled, and Vittorio realized this was the first time he had ever seen the ghost lose control, not from fear of death, but from the pain of a wound that had never healed. "Elena was the only woman I ever loved," Enzo whispered. "She left me when she learned what I did for a living. She said she couldn't live with a killer. I don't blame her. She was right. But she never told me she was pregnant." He stopped, swallowing with difficulty. The baby was in the hospital. No one claimed her. No one wanted her. Elena's family had abandoned her a long time ago, and she had nobody else. The baby would be sent to an orphanage if no one came to claim her within 72 hours. "I went to the hospital," Enzo went on, his voice turning softer, as if he were speaking of the most sacred moment of his life. "I saw her for the first time through the glass of the nursery. So tiny, so red, so fragile. But when the nurse carried her out and placed her in my hands, she opened her eyes and looked at me. Green eyes, exactly like her mother's. Enzo's voice caught, and I knew, in that moment, I couldn't go back to my old life. I couldn't kill at night and come home to hold my daughter in the morning. I couldn't let her grow up in that world of blood and darkness. Vittorio stood there, listening. He hadn't expected the story to go this way. He'd imagined 100 reasons for the ghost's disappearance. Everything from spying for a rival crew to stealing money from the organization. But he'd never once thought the reason could be that simple, that pure. A father trying to protect his daughter. "I've killed 47 people in my life," Enzo said, bitterness in his voice. 47 lives ended by these hands. These hands don't deserve to hold a child. Don't deserve to be called a father, but I wanted to try. He looked straight into Vittorio's eyes. I wanted to do one right thing in my life. Just once. Only once. So I disappeared, changed my name, moved to this neighborhood, lived like an ordinary man. Worked with my hands to feed my child. Since that night in the alley, since the day I chose her, I haven't touched a gun. I haven't killed anyone. I haven't contacted anyone from my old life. I've only been Enzo Brennan, a single father with a daughter and an old dog, Vittorio asked, his voice still cold, but something in it had shifted. You don't regret it. You don't regret giving up everything. Money, power, the name. Enzo smiled, the first smile since Vittorio had stepped into the room. No, he said simply. 20 years with Rosalie have been the happiest 20 years of my life. I don't have much money. I don't have a nice house. I don't have a luxury car, but I have my daughter. I got to watch her grow up, to teach her how to ride a bike, to hold her when she cried, to hear her call me Dad. Enzo's eyes shimmered, and Vittorio couldn't tell whether it was tears or only the candlelight reflected there. Those are things all the money in the world can't buy. Vittorio thought Enzo would keep going, would beg for his life, would offer every reason to be allowed a few more days. That was what most people did when death stood in front of them. But Enzo didn't. Instead, he said something that caught Vittorio completely off guard. I accept death, Enzo said, his voice strangely calm. I deserve punishment under the law. I betrayed the organization. I betrayed Don Caruso. I betrayed everything I once swore to protect. I'm not asking for mercy. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a plea Vittorio had never heard from an assassin. But Rosalie, she doesn't know anything. She's innocent. She doesn't know who her father used to be, what he used to do. She only knows I'm an ordinary father, one who has loved her with everything he has for 20 years. Enzo looked straight into Vittorio's eyes, green eyes burning. I'm only asking you one thing, he said. Don't let her get dragged into this. Don't let her learn who I really am. Let her remember me as a good father, not as a killer. That's the only thing I'm begging for. Vittorio stood there, the conflict inside him reaching its peak. Enzo had saved his life 20 years ago. Without that night, he wouldn't be standing here today. Wouldn't be the boss. Wouldn't have anything at all. He owed this man a life. But Enzo had also betrayed the organization. He'd broken the law Vittorio's father had set, the law Vittorio had sworn to uphold with his own blood. If he spared Enzo, he would be breaking that law. If he killed Enzo, he would be killing the man who had once saved him. There was no right answer, no perfect choice. Silence stretched through the narrow room. The candle on the bedside table was almost burned down, its light fading, darkness slowly swallowing everything. Vittorio could hear Enzo's strained breathing, the wind whistling outside, his own heart pounding. Finally, he spoke. You're dying, Vittorio said, his voice no longer as cold as before, carrying a strange exhaustion. I don't need to do it. Your illness will do it for me. Enzo looked at him, eyes flashing with a spark of hope, but Vittorio wasn't finished. But don't misunderstand, he said, his voice hardening again. This isn't forgiveness. This is me paying a debt. You saved my life 20 years ago. Now I'm letting you die naturally. After tonight, we don't owe each other anything. Enzo closed his eyes, a long breath leaving his thin chest. It wasn't the breath of fear or despair. It was the breath of relief, of a father who knew his daughter would be safe. Thank you, he whispered, so weak it was almost inaudible. Thank you, Vittorio. Vittorio turned and walked toward the door. The conversation was over. The debt had been paid. He had no reason to stay in this house for even one more second. He had work to do. Marco Benedetti waiting to be dealt with. an entire empire to run. A dying old assassin and the man's daughter weren't his problem. He'd already done more than the rules allowed. He pushed open the bedroom door and stepped out. Rosalie was sitting curled up on an old wooden chair in the corner of the living room, arms wrapped around herself as if she could hold on to warmth that way, eyes raw and red from crying. Phantom lay at her feet, head lowered, but its ears were still pricked, listening to everything. When she saw Vittorio come out, Rosalie sprang to her feet, her face full of worry and fear. "What did he say to you?" she asked, voice shaking. "What did my father say? What are you going to do to him?" Vittorio looked at her for a long moment. He saw the worry in her eyes, saw the love she carried for the father who was fading in the room behind him. She didn't know anything about Enzo's past. She didn't know he'd been a killer. She didn't know the hands that had raised her were stained with the blood of 47 lives. She only knew he was her father, the only man who had loved her for 20 years. "Take better care of your father," Vittorio said, his voice no longer as cold as before, carrying a tone he couldn't name. "He needs you beside him." Rosalie started to say something, but Vittorio had already turned away, moving toward the front door. He put his hand on the knob, ready to open it and step out into the white snow night, leaving this house and everything inside it behind. But he hadn't turned it yet when Phantom suddenly shot to its feet. The dog went rigid, ears high, black eyes locked on the hallway that led to the bedroom and the bathroom. Then it barked. Not the threatening bark Vittorio had heard when it took down Tommy, not the territorial growl of a guard dog. This was an alarm, urgent, the bark of a dog trained to recognize when something was wrong with its handler. Phantom bolted down the hall, barking echoing through the small house. Rosalie froze in fear. "Phantom, what is it? What's wrong? Phantom." But the dog didn't stop. It ran straight to the bathroom, planted itself in front of the half-open door, and barked wildly. Vittorio understood at once. The instinct of a fighter, the instinct of a man who had survived countless dangerous moments, snapped awake inside him. He spun and charged down the hall, past Rosalie before she could even react. He shoved the bathroom door open and went still for a beat. Enzo was on the cold floor, unmoving. The man had tried to get up and use the toilet, maybe because he didn't want to bother his daughter, maybe because the pride of an assassin refused to be cared for like a child, but his wrecked body couldn't take it. He'd fallen halfway, his head striking the edge of the sink, and now he lay there, lips turning blue, face white as paper. Rosalie ran in behind Vittorio, and when she saw her father lying motionless on the floor, a scream tore out of her throat. "Dad! Dad!" She lunged into the bathroom, reaching for him, but Vittorio was faster. He dropped to his knees beside Enzo, fingers pressing to his neck to check for a pulse. He felt a faint flutter, and then nothing. The pulse was gone. Cardiac arrest. He lowered his ear near Enzo's mouth, trying to catch a breath. Almost none, only faint, rasping sounds, as if the lungs were too exhausted to keep working. "Respiratory failure," Vittorio said, his voice cold and sharp as a blade, leaving no room for emotion. "Call an ambulance. Now." Rosalie stood frozen, eyes wide with horror, tears running down her cheeks. She couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at her father on the cold floor. Vittorio didn't wait for her to react. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket, punched in a number, and brought it to his ear. His voice was steel as he spoke into it. "Sal, clear a path to St. Vincent. Now. No delays. I need an ambulance at this address in 5 minutes. Not a second longer." He gave the address, then ended the call without waiting for Sal to answer. He knew his loyal man would carry out the order without questions. That was why Vittorio trusted Sal more than anyone else in the organization. Phantom rushed into the bathroom. The dog lay down beside Enzo, licking his face as if trying to wake him. A soft whimper filled the small room, anxious and desperate. 5 years together, and the dog could sense its owner was in danger, and it could do nothing except stay beside him. Vittorio started first aid. He placed both hands on Enzo's chest and began pressing in steady rhythm, the exact technique of CPR he'd learned years ago, back when he'd been a low-level soldier forced to face every kind of danger. He didn't know why he was doing this. 5 minutes ago, he'd been ready to leave and let Enzo die. That had been the rational decision. That had been what a mafia boss should do. But now he was kneeling on the cold floor of a house with no heat and no electricity, trying to save the life of a traitor. And he couldn't explain why. Rosalie dropped to her knees beside her father, gripping Enzo's thin hand, tears falling like rain. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Don't go. Please don't go. I need you. I can't lose you." Vittorio kept compressing Enzo's chest, counting each beat in his head. He knew time was everything. Every second without oxygen was a second Enzo's brain was dying. 5 minutes. He demanded an ambulance in 5 minutes. He only had to keep Enzo alive for 5 minutes. In the snowy night outside, the wail of an ambulance siren rose in the distance, still far, but coming closer. Vittorio kept pressing, didn't stop, didn't give up. He didn't know whether he was saving a life or trying to buy back pieces of his own soul. In this moment, it didn't matter. Only one thing mattered: keeping Enzo Brennan breathing. Vittorio kept compressing Enzo's chest, counting each beat in his head, forcing the man's fragile heart to keep working. Sweat dotted his forehead even in the freezing room. The muscles in his arms started to burn, but he didn't dare stop. Rosalie knelt beside her father, both hands locked around Enzo's thin hand. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but no sound came out. It was as if she'd cried herself empty, and all that remained was the silent despair of a daughter, watching her father fight for life 1 second at a time. Phantom sat close by, black eyes fixed on Enzo's ashen face. Then the dog lifted its head and howled. The sound was raw and wrenching, filling the cold house, cutting through the thin walls, spilling out into the white snow night beyond. This wasn't the bark of an ordinary dog. It was the cry of a warrior watching his comrade fall, the grief of a loyal friend who could feel death drawing near. 5 minutes passed, long as 5 hours. Every second stretched into infinity, every compression like a wordless prayer. Vittorio didn't know who he was praying to, or what he was praying for. He only knew he couldn't let Enzo die right now. Not like this. Not in front of the daughter kneeling beside him with eyes full of hopelessness. Then the ambulance siren wailed, tearing through the quiet night. The sound was like a bell of deliverance, carrying a thin strand of hope through the darkness. Vittorio heard the vehicle stop at the door. The slam of doors. Quick footsteps on snow. The front door flew open, and 4 people in medical uniforms rushed in, carrying a stretcher and the most advanced equipment. This wasn't a standard city ambulance. This was St. Vincent, the private hospital the Caruso family had funded with millions for decades. The hospital where doctors and nurses knew that when Caruso called, they answered immediately. No questions, no paperwork, no hesitation. The lead medic, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes, recognized Vittorio the moment he stepped into the bathroom. He nodded, professional but respectful. "Mr. Caruso." Just those 2 words. No questions about why a Mafia boss was in a collapsing house. No curiosity about the patient's identity. No pause at all. The team moved at once, easing Vittorio aside and taking over. They lifted Enzo onto the stretcher, fitted an oxygen mask over his face, clipped a heart monitor to his chest. The machine's weak beeping sounded, slow and irregular, but it was there. Enzo was still alive. They rushed the stretcher out, and Rosalie ran after them, panic bursting from her. "I have to go with my father. I have to come. Please, let me come with him." Vittorio stepped out of the house and watched the ambulance preparing to pull away. He looked at Rosalie standing in the snow, shaking from cold and fear, not knowing what to do with herself. He didn't know why he said what he said next. "Get in my car," he said, clipped and direct. "It'll be faster." Rosalie looked at him, eyes full of confusion, but she didn't have time to think. She ran toward the black Bentley parked at the mouth of the alley, where Sal was already waiting. Vittorio got behind the wheel. Rosalie slid into the passenger seat. He hit the gas, and the car lunged forward, chasing the ambulance as its siren screamed through empty streets. Inside the car, neither of them spoke for the first few minutes. Only the engine's roar, the ambulance siren ahead, and Rosalie's unsteady breathing. She sat with her hands clenched together, eyes locked on the ambulance's red lights, as if her father would vanish the moment she looked away. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" Rosalie finally spoke, her voice small and shaking. "Please tell me he'll be okay. Please tell me my dad will live." Vittorio didn't answer. He wasn't the kind of man who lied to comfort someone. He didn't know if Enzo would survive. He didn't know if they'd get to the hospital in time. He only knew he was driving as fast as he could, and that was all he could do. Inside his mind, thoughts spun in chaos. 5 minutes ago, he'd been ready to walk away. He'd decided Enzo wasn't his problem anymore. The debt was paid. He could turn his back and never look again. And yet now he was racing death itself, driving through the snow night to save a traitor's life. What would his father think if he could see this? Don Caruso, the man who wrote the law that traitors must die. What would he say if he knew his son was trying to save the ghost? Vittorio didn't know the answer. But he didn't slow down. He kept driving, following the ambulance's red lights toward St. Vincent, where Enzo Brennan's fate would likely be decided. As the Bentley accelerated away from the curb, Vittorio caught a glimpse of a dark shadow in the rearview mirror. Phantom was running not with speed, but with a bone-deep, desperate persistence that seemed to defy his heavy frame. The dog's paws threw up clumps of frozen snow as he fought to keep sight of the red ambulance lights. The Bentley moved slowly through the thick snow, but even so, Phantom struggled. The old dog pushed its heavy frame to the limit, refusing to let the taillights fade. Phantom's pace faltered. His heavy frame wasn't built for distance. And finally, his legs gave out. He collapsed into the white powder, a small, dark speck hunched in the middle of the desolate, frozen street, still staring in the direction his master had vanished. Rosalie didn't see it, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed, but Vittorio did. The man who lived by the rule of never looking back suddenly felt a strange tightening in his chest. "Sal, stop the car," Vittorio commanded, his voice a low, impossible-to-refuse growl. "Boss? We're losing the ambulance's trail. Turn around." Vittorio cut him off, his gray eyes fixed on the mirror. "We don't leave a warrior behind to freeze." The Bentley performed a sharp U-turn, tires shrieking against the ice. When the door opened, Phantom didn't bark. He simply dragged his exhausted, shivering body into the car, his wet fur pressing against Vittorio's expensive cashmere coat. Vittorio didn't move away. He looked at the dog, then at the girl, and for the first time, the silence in the car felt less like a void and more like a bond. The Bentley stopped at the gates of St. Vincent only seconds after the ambulance. This was one of the most expensive private hospitals in New York, a place only the richest and most powerful could set foot inside. And it was also where the Caruso family had poured millions for decades, turning it into their own territory in the medical world. Enzo was taken straight into a VIP emergency suite without a single formality. No identification, no insurance, no questions about his name or his ability to pay. One call from Caruso was enough to open every door, erase every procedure, turn the impossible into something that simply happened. Vittorio entered the hospital with Rosalie close behind, and everything around them seemed to shift. The two security guards at the main entrance saw Vittorio and immediately lowered their heads and stepped aside, clearing a path without a word. They didn't ask who he was. They didn't demand a badge. They did nothing but bow like subjects before their king. As Vittorio moved down the corridor, Rosalie caught the whispers of nurses and staff. "Caruso," a small voice murmured. "That's Boss Caruso. Don't look. Don't ask. Just do your job." People moved out of the way as they passed. No one dared meet Vittorio's eyes. No one dared block his path. Heads dipped. Bodies shifted aside. Voices fell into frightened murmurs. Vittorio walked through the hospital like a king through his kingdom, and everyone around him knew exactly where they stood. Rosalie watched it all with eyes wide in shock and fear. She had lived 20 years in the dark, knowing nothing of the underworld, nothing of men like Vittorio Caruso. But now she was seeing his power with her own eyes. She was watching an entire hospital bow to one man. She was beginning to understand that the person who had helped her and her father was no ordinary businessman. They reached the VIP waiting room, a spacious lounge with leather sofas and soft, calming light. Rosalie sat down, her face drained white, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Vittorio, standing by the window, expression cold and unreadable, and she couldn't hold back the question burning in her chest. "Who are you?" she asked, voice small and shaking. "People. They're afraid of you. They bow to you. Who are you really?" Vittorio didn't answer her question. Instead, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number, his voice cold and sharp as steel when he spoke. "Dr. Webb." 10 minutes, not a second later. He ended the call, then sat in the chair across from Rosalie in silence. No explanation, no answer, only the heavy quiet settling over the room. 20 minutes crawled by in tense waiting. Rosalie sat there, eyes red and swollen, staring at the emergency room door, praying for her father. Vittorio sat opposite her, still as stone, no one able to read what was happening behind those cold gray eyes. Then a commotion rose near the front. Rosalie lifted her head and saw something that made her heart feel like it shattered. Phantom leaped out of the Bentley the moment the doors opened, his eyes fixed on the stretcher carrying Enzo. He ignored the sterile smell of the hospital, focused only on staying close to the man who had been his world for 5 years. The nurses and guards stepped back, intimidated by the massive dog's silent intensity, as he followed the VIP team inside. A guard stepped forward, voice firm. "No dogs in the hospital. That's the policy. Please take the dog outside." Vittorio didn't say a word. He only looked at the guard, gray eyes cold as ice. Just a look. No spoken threat. No aggressive gesture. Just a look. The guard immediately stepped back, lowered his head, and vanished as if he'd never existed. Phantom walked heavily into the waiting room, his eyes filled with a deep, weary anxiety for his master. The dog found Rosalie and moved toward her, then lay down at her feet, its head settling on her lap. Its black eyes stayed fixed on the emergency room door where its handler was fighting between life and death. Rosalie stroked Phantom's fur, tears running down her cheeks. She didn't know how the dog had gotten here, didn't know how far it had run through the snow night, but she knew one thing: Phantom loved her father more than its own life. After a long silence, Rosalie lifted her head and looked at Vittorio, eyes exhausted and bewildered. "You've repaid my father," she said, her voice small and hoarse. "You saved him. You brought him to the best hospital. Your debt is paid. So why are you still here?" Vittorio looked at her, and for the first time tonight, something flickered across his cold face. Not softness, not empathy, something closer to confusion, something even he didn't understand. He stayed silent for a long time, looking into Rosalie's eyes, looking at Phantom resting at her feet, looking at the emergency room door where Enzo was struggling against death, and finally he said, so quietly it was almost a whisper, "I don't know." 3 words, simple and honest. The first time Vittorio Caruso had told the truth to anyone but himself in many years. 2 hours passed in a cruel kind of waiting. 2 hours where every minute stretched like a year, every second heavy as an entire lifetime. Rosalie sat on the sofa, not sleeping, not eating, not drinking, her hand moving again and again through Phantom's fur, as if it were the only way to keep herself from falling apart. The dog lay at her feet, black eyes never leaving the emergency room door, as if it too was waiting, praying in the only way a dog knew. Vittorio sat across from her, still as carved stone. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He barely seemed to breathe, but his eyes never stopped tracking the emergency room door, never stopped measuring every shift in the air around them. He had sat like that for the full 2 hours, showing no fatigue, no impatience, as if time meant nothing to him. At last, the emergency room door opened. Dr. Harrison Webb stepped out, a middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes worn with exhaustion yet still holding on to professionalism. He was the chief of emergency medicine at St. Vincent, one of the best doctors in New York, and also the man the Caruso family trusted most when things went wrong. Dr. Webb scanned the waiting room, and his gaze stopped on Vittorio first. He nodded, a gesture of respect for the most powerful man in the room, and only then turned to Rosalie. "He's awake," Dr. Webb said, calm but not pleased. Rosalie shot to her feet, eyes lighting with a thin, desperate hope. "Awake?" she asked, voice shaking with emotion. "My father is awake. He's going to get better, isn't he?" "He'll be okay, doctor." Phantom rose too, tail giving a small wag as if it could feel her hope. But Dr. Webb didn't smile. He glanced at Vittorio for a second, as if asking permission or bracing for support, then looked back at Rosalie, and when he spoke, his voice dropped, carrying a weight Rosalie had never wanted to hear. "Miss Brennan, I need to be honest with you," Dr. Webb said, each word landing like a stone on her heart. "His lung disease is at the end stage. Severe respiratory failure, organ systems breaking down, the body too weak to withstand any surgery or aggressive treatment." Rosalie stood there, eyes wide, unable to believe what she was hearing. She wanted to speak, wanted to argue, wanted to scream that he had to be wrong, but her throat felt crushed, and no sound could come out. "We've done everything we can," Dr. Webb went on, his tone gentler but the truth still brutal. "We can keep him going a few more hours, maybe a few days." But he stopped, swallowing, as if he didn't want to say what came next. "But what?" Rosalie whispered, so softly it was nearly nothing. "But what, doctor?" Dr. Webb looked at her with eyes full of compassion. "You should go in and see him," he said quietly. Now, Rosalie understood. She understood what those words truly meant. This wasn't go in to celebrate recovery. This was go in to say goodbye. Her knees gave out. She didn't have the strength to stay standing. She sank back onto the sofa, both hands covering her face, and broken sobs pushed their way out of her throat. Phantom let out a small howl, a sound of pain and helplessness, as if the dog understood the tragedy unfolding. Vittorio stood. He walked to Rosalie, and for a moment he did something he hadn't done with anyone in years. He placed a hand on her shoulder, only for a second. Only a small gesture, but it was more than Boss Caruso had ever given anyone. It was all he knew how to do, all he could offer to comfort someone in pain. Rosalie lifted her head and looked at Vittorio through tears. She didn't speak, but she understood. She understood that this cold man, in his own way, was trying to stand with her. She got up, legs trembling, and started toward the room where her father was waiting. Phantom followed at her side, never leaving her for a step. Rosalie pushed open the hospital room door and stepped inside, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The room was flooded with the hospital's cold white light. The sharp scent of antiseptic hit her nose, and the steady beep of the heart monitor sounded like fate counting down. Enzo lay on the bed, surrounded by machines and lines. A breathing tube sat at his nose. An IV ran into his arm. The monitor beside him chimed weakly. His body looked even smaller and more fragile than it had in that dark, freezing house, as if with every passing second life was slipping a little farther away. But when Rosalie entered, Enzo's eyes opened, and in that moment, they brightened with endless love, brightened with the joy of seeing his daughter one last time. "My girl," he whispered, so weak it was almost nothing, yet Rosalie heard every word, every sound carving itself into her heart. "Come here. Come to Dad." Rosalie rushed to the bedside, unable to hold herself together anymore. She took her father's thin hand, the hand that had held her when she was small, that had taught her to ride a bike, that had wiped her tears every time she cried. Tears poured down her face like rain, falling onto his hand, soaking the hospital's white blanket. "Dad," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "Don't go. Please don't go. I need you. I can't live without you. Please, please don't leave me." Phantom followed Rosalie into the room, and no one stopped it. The dog moved to the bed, placed its front paws on the mattress edge, and lowered its head beside Enzo's other hand. Its black eyes lifted to its handler's pale face, and a low whine slipped from its throat, full of pain and helplessness. Enzo looked at his daughter, then at his loyal dog, and a faint smile touched his lips. He tried to speak, each sentence dragged out with effort, as if every word cost him a piece of the life he had left. "I'm sorry, my girl," he said, his voice trembling. "I've hidden too much from you. I haven't been honest with you about my past, about what I did before you came into my life." Rosalie shook her head, tears still streaming. "I don't need to know. I don't care. I just need you. Please don't go." Enzo kept going, as if he had to say these things before it was too late. "I did terrible things in the past. Things you should never know, never hear. I wasn't a good man, sweetheart. I lived a life full of sin and regret." He paused, drawing in a deep breath, green eyes shining. "But you're the only thing I ever did right," he said, and his voice carried a warmth Rosalie had never heard before. "These 20 years, being your father, watching you grow, hearing you call me Dad every day, those were the happiest 20 years of my life. You're my miracle, my girl. You're the reason I kept going." Enzo reached his shaking hand toward Phantom and stroked the dog's fur with endless gentleness. "Phantom, old friend," he whispered. 5 years. We've had 5 years together. You protected me. You stayed with me when it was hardest. Now I need you to do one thing. Protect her, the way you protected me. Never leave her." Phantom whined, as if it understood every word. It licked Enzo's hand, a gesture of love and promise. Enzo looked toward the door and saw Vittorio standing there, his face cold as ever, but his eyes carrying something unfamiliar. "Caruso," Enzo called, weakly. Vittorio stepped in and stood at the foot of the bed, looking down at the man who had once been a legend and was now lying there waiting to die. "Thank you," Enzo said, each word clear, though frail. Thank you for being here. Thank you for not walking away. Thank you for giving me the chance to say goodbye to my daughter. Vittorio nodded, saying nothing. He wasn't the kind of man who knew how to offer comfort with words, but his presence said everything. Keep your promise, Enzo said, eyes holding Vittorio's. Keep your promise to me. Vittorio nodded once more, an oath that didn't need to be spoken. Enzo turned back to Rosalie and lifted his trembling hand to her cheek. His fingers wiped away the tears running down her face, the way he had done thousands of times over 20 years. My girl, he whispered, a smile on his lips, the peaceful smile of a man who had found redemption. I love you. I love you more than anything in this world. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Remember that. Always remember that I love you. Rosalie gripped his hand tighter, tears still falling. I love you, Dad, she cried. I love you, Dad. Enzo smiled, a quiet, satisfied smile of a father who had finished his last duty. Enzo caressed his daughter's cheek one more time, his thin fingers trembling as they traced the tear-soaked skin of Rosalie's face. His eyes held her with every ounce of love a father could give, holding her as if he wanted to carve her features into his soul before he stepped into eternal sleep. Then, slowly, those eyes closed. There was no pain, no fear, only the peace of a man who had finished the last mission of his life. The smile stayed on his lips, the smile of a father grateful to see his daughter in his final seconds. His hand slipped down, falling away from Rosalie's cheek, coming to rest on the white hospital blanket. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm in the room. Beep, 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 each sound a heartbeat growing weaker. Then the beep slowed, slower, slower still, and finally a long, unbroken tone filled the air, the sound of an ending, the flat line on the screen. Enzo Brennan, the ghost, father, friend, was gone. Rosalie froze for a moment, as if her mind refused to accept what was happening. Then she screamed, a raw, shattering sound that tore through the room. Dad! No, Dad! Don't go! Please don't leave me! She shook him, grabbed his shoulders, tried to wake him as if this were only an ordinary sleep, but Enzo didn't respond. His body lay there, still, silent, as if the soul had already left it long ago. The hospital room door flew open. Dr. Webb and 2 nurses rushed in with resuscitation equipment. They moved Rosalie aside gently but firmly and began the emergency procedures. A shock. Chest compressions. Another shock. But the line on the monitor didn't change. Everyone knew it was too late. It had been too late for a long time. Phantom stood by the bed, black eyes fixed on Enzo's motionless face. The dog stood there for a few seconds, as if it couldn't believe the friend who had been beside it for 5 years was gone. It sniffed, pressed its nose to Enzo's limp hand, waiting for him to wake and stroke its head the way he always did. But Enzo didn't move, didn't react. No breath remained. Then Phantom lifted its head, black eyes turning toward the ceiling, and it howled. The sound was a wound, filling the room, piercing through the door, spilling into the hallway, echoing across the hospital floor. This wasn't a normal howl. This was the cry of a warrior sending off his last comrade. This was the grief of a loyal friend, losing the reason it existed. 5 years together. 5 years of danger and survival, life and death side by side. 5 years of protection, love, and unconditional devotion. And tonight, it ended. Phantom had lost its last friend, its only handler, the man who had saved it and given it a new life. The howl reverberated through the hospital. Out in the corridor, nurses stopped mid-step. Patients fell silent. Everyone listened to that pain. There was something in Phantom's cry that reached into every heart, touched the ache of loss everyone had known or feared. It was the sound of a final separation, the mourning of a love that doesn't fade. Vittorio stood in the corner of the room, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He had seen death all his life. He had caused more deaths than he could count. To him, death was part of the job, a number in a ledger, a problem to be handled. But tonight was different. Tonight he watched a man die who had chosen love over power, who had chosen his daughter over everything else in the world. He chose his daughter over everything. Vittorio thought, eyes on Enzo's peaceful face. He lived 20 years as an ordinary man, as an ordinary father. And he died in peace, with his daughter beside him in his last moments. Maybe that was the real victory. Not money, not power, not the name, but being loved, being remembered, being mourned by the people who mattered most. Vittorio looked at Rosalie, collapsed beside her father's bed, shoulders shaking with broken sobs. She had lost everything in one night. The only father she had, the only family she had, everything. He remembered his promise to Enzo. Don't let her get dragged into this. Don't let her learn who her father really was. And in the silence, Vittorio Caruso, the coldest and most ruthless boss in New York, made a vow to himself. I'll keep my word. I'll protect her, no matter what it costs. 3 days later, they buried Enzo Brennan in a small cemetery on the outskirts of New York. Snow still fell, laying a white sheet over old graves and bare branches. The funeral was painfully simple. No crowd of mourners, no lavish wreaths, no long eulogies. Only Rosalie stood beside the grave, eyes dried out from crying, and Phantom sat at her side, black eyes fixed on the casket as it was lowered slowly into the ground. Far off, beneath the trunk of an old oak at the edge of the cemetery, a few dark silhouettes stood guard in silence. Vittorio's men, ordered to protect the girl without letting her know, and apart from everyone, Vittorio Caruso stood alone, his black coat blending into the tree's shadow, eyes watching the burial from a distance. He didn't come closer. He didn't want Rosalie to know he was there. He only stood and watched a daughter say goodbye to her father for the last time, and inside him a promise was beginning to take shape. The funeral costs had been paid. Rosalie didn't know who had covered them. She only knew that when she asked about the bill, they told her everything had been handled. She didn't have the time or strength to dig into it. She could only stand there, watching her father disappear beneath cold earth, trying not to collapse. 3 days after the funeral, Vittorio went to the small house in Southside. He noticed right away that the electricity had been restored, a weak yellow light spilling through the window in the early evening. That was something he had arranged the night of the hospital. One short call to the utility company's manager, and everything fixed within hours. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again, then pushed the door gently. It wasn't locked. Inside, Rosalie sat on the cold floor, her back against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing. Phantom lay beside her, its head on her lap, black eyes tired but still alert when Vittorio stepped in. She looked so worn down that Vittorio stopped short. Her eyes were hollow in their sockets. Her auburn hair was tangled, unbrushed. Her skin was so pale it looked almost translucent. She hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, hadn't done anything in days. She just sat there, like an empty body, waiting for something she didn't even know she was waiting for. "What are you going to do now?" Vittorio asked, his voice no longer as cold as before, carrying a tone even he didn't recognize. Rosalie lifted her head to look at him, eyes blank, lifeless. "I don't know," she said, her voice hoarse and exhausted. "I don't have money, no job, no family, nothing." She looked down at Phantom, her hand stroking the dog's fur without thinking. "I can't even take care of Phantom," she whispered, pain and helplessness in every word. "He deserves better. He deserves warmth, food, a good life, not starving and freezing with me in this house." Vittorio stood there, looking at the girl and the dog. He saw Phantom, never leaving Rosalie's side, still loyal though its old handler was gone, still protecting even as it suffered too. He saw the photograph of Enzo and Rosalie on the wall, the one he'd noticed the first night in this house, the picture of a happy father and a small daughter, and he remembered his promise to Enzo. Don't let her get dragged into this. Don't let her learn who her father really was. Protect her. Vittorio didn't say anything else. He turned and walked out of the house, stepping into the quiet alley blanketed in snow. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket, dialed a familiar number, and brought it to his ear. "Sal." His voice was short and final. "Bring a suitcase here. 1 million. Cash." 20 minutes later, a black car stopped at the mouth of the alley. Sal got out, a sleek black leather suitcase in his hand, and hurried toward Vittorio, who was waiting by the door of the house. The loyal soldier set the case down in front of his boss, then leaned in, whispering with open disbelief. "Boss, 1 million. For this girl. Who is she that you'd spend that kind of money?" Vittorio didn't answer. He only looked at Sal with his familiar cold stare, then gave a small gesture for him to wait outside. Sal understood at once. He nodded and stepped back. taking position at the end of the alley without asking another question. He'd followed Vittorio long enough to know that, when the boss didn't want to explain, nobody had the right to ask. Vittorio lifted the suitcase and walked into the house. Rosalie was still in the same spot, back against the wall, empty eyes fixed on nothing. She didn't even react as he came closer, as if she'd lost the ability to care about anything happening around her. Phantom raised its head, black eyes tracking Vittorio with wary attention, but the dog didn't growl or threaten. Vittorio set the suitcase on the floor, right in front of Rosalie. He clicked the locks, and the lid sprang open, revealing stacks of cash arranged neatly inside. Crisp new $100 bills, bundled into perfect blocks, filling the entire case. The weak light bulb reflected off the money, creating something almost unreal inside this poor little house. Rosalie stared at the suitcase, eyes widening in shock. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What is this?" Vittorio stood straight, looking down at her with his usual stone face. "I want to buy Phantom," he said, voice flat and emotionless. $1 million. Rosalie didn't believe she'd heard him. She looked from the suitcase full of money to Vittorio, then to Phantom, as if she were trying to understand a joke she couldn't possibly grasp. 1 million, she repeated, bewildered. "Are you out of your mind? There's no dog in the world worth $1 million. Phantom is just an old dog. He's not some rare breed or a champion show dog. This dog is worth it," Vittorio said, his voice still steel cold, allowing no argument. "And this is the price I'm paying. I don't bargain." Rosalie looked down at Phantom, and tears started to fall. The dog looked back at her, black eyes full of feeling, tail giving a small wag as if it were trying to comfort her. Phantom was her last friend, her last link to her father, the only living thing left in the world that truly needed her and loved her. And now she was about to sell him. "I don't want to lose him," Rosalie sobbed, wrapping Phantom tight in her arms. "He's all I have left. He's my only friend. But I don't have a choice. I don't have money. I don't have a way to live. I don't have a way to take care of him. If I keep him, we'll both starve together," she cried, her tears soaking into Phantom's black-gray fur. The dog whined and licked her face as if it were trying to wipe the tears away. Vittorio stood there, watching, and something in his chest tightened. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know how to name it. He only knew he couldn't let this girl suffer anymore. "The money is yours," Vittorio spoke, and his voice, though still controlled, carried something unfamiliar. "But I need you to keep Phantom for me." Rosalie lifted her head, tears still streaming, eyes full of confusion. "Keep him for you," she repeated, not sure she'd heard right. "You want me to keep Phantom for you?" Vittorio nodded, his face giving nothing away. "Someone in my house is allergic to dog hair," he said, as calmly as if he were talking about the weather. "I can't keep him there, but I've paid $1 million for this dog, and I need someone I can trust to take care of it. You're the best choice." Rosalie looked at him, then at the suitcase, then at Phantom, and slowly she understood. This wasn't buying and selling. This wasn't a business deal. This was the coldest mafia boss in New York finding a way to give her money without making her feel like she was accepting charity. This was Vittorio Caruso showing care without having to say the word. Tears ran down Rosalie's face again, but this time they weren't the tears of pain or despair. They were tears of gratitude, of being shaken by kindness disguised as coldness. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice breaking. "You don't owe me anything. You saved my father. You gave him the chance to say goodbye to me. You don't need to do anything more." Vittorio stood, turned his back to her, and walked toward the door. He didn't look back when he spoke, his voice still cold but carrying an unshakable certainty. "I owed your father. Now I don't owe anyone." He walked out without turning around, without a farewell. The door closed behind him, leaving Rosalie sitting there with a suitcase full of money and a loyal dog at her side. Phantom watched Vittorio through the narrowing gap of the closing door, and just before the door shut completely, the dog barked once. Not a warning bark, not a threat. A soft bark, almost like thank you. A goodbye between one warrior and another. The black Bentley glided smoothly through Brooklyn's empty streets, streetlights throwing shadows across the windows like brief streaks of light that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Vittorio sat in the back seat, eyes aimed out the glass but not truly seeing anything. His mind was spinning with thoughts he couldn't arrange into anything clear. Sal drove in silence, glancing at his boss now and then in the rearview mirror but never daring to ask. After a long while, Vittorio finally spoke, his voice settling back into the familiar coldness of a mafia boss. "Marco Benedetti. Where is he?" Sal answered at once. "Professional. We found him, boss. He's hiding in an old warehouse on 47th Street, near the docks. He thought we didn't know about that place, but one of our men has been tracking him for 2 days." Sal paused, a brief, rare smirk tugging at his lips. Tommy is still nursing his pride, but he won't go near a dog again. Vittorio nodded, then asked a question Sal hadn't expected. Who told the debt collectors where to find that girl? Where to find the ghost? Sal went silent for a second, as if weighing whether he should say it out loud. Then he answered carefully. "Marco. He sold information to both sides. He sold details about our warehouses to Moretti, and he's the one who sold the ghost's location to the collectors from the old organization. He made money from every angle, didn't care what it cost." Vittorio listened, his face giving nothing away, but his eyes darkened slightly. Marco Benedetti hadn't only betrayed the Caruso family, he had indirectly caused all the suffering Rosalie had endured. Without Marco, the collectors would have never found Enzo. Enzo might have had a few more days, a few more weeks, maybe enough time for Rosalie to brace herself for her father's death. But Marco had stolen even that. "Deal with him," Vittorio said, voice cold as ice. "No need to be quick." Sal nodded, understanding. "Yes, boss." Vittorio continued, and there was a hard decisiveness in him that couldn't be argued with. "Southside, from 5th Street to 12th Street. I want it clean. Not a single thug, not a single pimp, not a single addict sets foot in that area. Streetlights, power, water, all of it functioning normally within 48 hours, and let every small crew in the region know. That territory is under Caruso protection now. Anyone touches it, I'll handle them myself." Sal couldn't hide his surprise. "Boss," he asked carefully, "all of this, for that girl?" Vittorio didn't answer. He only stared out the window, eyes distant, and his silence was a clearer answer than any words. Over the next 48 hours, Southside Brooklyn went through a transformation no one could explain. The small gangs that had ruled the streets there simply vanished, slipping away in the night after word came down from the Caruso family. No one dared push back. No one dared ask why. When Caruso gave an order, people obeyed. It was that simple. The pimps who used to stand on corners stopped showing up. The addicts who wandered the dark alleys went elsewhere. The collectors who had threatened Rosalie and her father disappeared without a trace. No one knew where they went, and no one dared ask. Streetlights were repaired, one by one bursting into life at night, driving away the darkness that had hung over the neighborhood for years. Power and water were restored for poor households, people who had lived too long in cold and shadow. It was all free, all paid for by an unnamed source nobody could identify. 3 days later, Marco Benedetti was found in an alley in South Manhattan. He was alive, but he would never walk again. Both his legs had been crushed so completely that no surgery could save them. Police arrived, documented the scene, but no one truly investigated. Everyone knew whose work it was. Everyone understood the message. Betray Caruso, and you pay the price. And that price was sometimes worse than death. Rosalie knew nothing about any of it. She only knew that one morning, when she opened the window and looked outside, the street looked different, cleaner, safer. Streetlights burned bright at night. The frightening figures who used to drift through the alleys were gone. No one knocked on her door demanding money anymore. No one threatened her anymore. She didn't understand why, but she was grateful. Phantom sat by the window, black eyes watching the changed street. The dog sat there for hours, as if standing guard, as if protecting that small house against any danger that might come. And maybe, in its own way, it was doing exactly what Enzo had asked. Protect Rosalie, the way it had protected Enzo for 5 years. 3 months had passed since that fateful, snowy night. The brutal winter had given way to a warmer spring, the snow had melted, and tender buds began to appear on the branches lining Brooklyn's streets. Southside was no longer the dark and dangerous place it had been. Under the quiet protection of the Caruso family, it had become a peaceful neighborhood, where people could walk without fear, where streetlights stayed on, and children's laughter carried through small parks. Rosalie's house had changed, too. It was no longer the freezing place without power or heat. Now it had been repaired, freshly painted, warm, and alive. Rosalie had a new job managing a small corner cafe, where she brewed fragrant cups of coffee and smiled as she welcomed customers every day. She didn't know the cafe owner was one of Caruso's people, that the job had been arranged so she could stand on her own without depending on anyone. She only knew life was slowly getting better, and she was grateful for it. Phantom was still by her side, healthier than before, its black-gray coat glossy, its eyes bright and sharp. The dog followed her to the cafe each day, lying in its familiar corner, black eyes always tracking her as if carrying out a promise to the old handler who was gone. That afternoon, a familiar black Bentley stopped in front of the cafe. Vittorio Caruso stepped out, black suit as always, cold face as always, but something was different in his gaze as he looked into the small cafe. Sal stood outside on watch, and Vittorio went in alone. Rosalie was behind the counter, and when she saw him, a smile bloomed on her lips, the first real smile since her father died. Not a polite smile, not a forced one, a genuine smile, the smile of someone happy to see a familiar face. Phantom recognized Vittorio at once. The dog jumped up, tail wagging hard, ran to him and bumped its head against his leg in a warm greeting. Vittorio bent down, his hand stroking Phantom's head, his voice still cool, but carrying a softness he didn't even notice. Still looking strong. "Coffee?" Rosalie asked, green eyes sparkling. "On the house for Phantom's owner." Vittorio sat at a small table by the window and accepted the hot cup Rosalie set down in front of him. She sat across from him, hands wrapped around her own coffee, and looked at him with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, gentle but sincere. "For everything. I know you did more than you ever admitted. This neighborhood, this job, everything that changed. I know it was you." Vittorio took a sip, his face unreadable. "I don't know what you're talking about." Rosalie smiled, a playful smile Vittorio had never seen on her face before. "You're the worst liar I've ever met, Mr. Caruso." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the first night they met. This was a warm, easy quiet. The silence of two people who had been through too much together and didn't need words to understand. Vittorio looked at her, at the girl who was completely different from the desperate young woman on the sidewalk that snowy night, begging a stranger to buy her dog. Now she was stronger, brighter, full of life. Rosalie looked back at him, and she wasn't afraid of the Mafia boss anymore. She saw a man who had helped her when she had no one, protected her when she couldn't protect herself, given her a new life when she thought she'd lost everything. Phantom lay between them, its head resting on Vittorio's foot like a bridge between two people from two different worlds. Vittorio stood, set his cup on the table, and headed for the door. Rosalie rose with him. "You'll come back, won't you?" she asked, her voice carrying a hope she didn't try to hide. Vittorio paused, not turning around. "I have to check on what's mine regularly, and that includes more than just the dog." "Your dog?" Rosalie asked, eyes shining. "I paid $1 million for him," Vittorio said, still cool, but there was something in his tone that felt like a hidden smile. "Of course he's mine." Rosalie laughed, a light, warm sound filling the small cafe, the laugh of someone who had learned how to be happy again after too much pain. Vittorio walked outside without looking back, but if someone had been watching closely, they would have seen the corner of his mouth lift. For the first time in many years, the coldest, most ruthless Mafia boss in New York had smiled. Some debts can never truly be paid, but sometimes a debt becomes something more, a reason to protect, a reason to return, and maybe a reason to feel human again. The ghost was gone, but his legacy lived on, in a daughter who had learned to smile again, in a dog who never stopped standing guard, and in a Mafia boss who discovered that even the coldest heart can still beat. This story offers us a profound lesson about loyalty, about unconditional love, and about the power of redemption. Enzo Brennan, a man with a past full of sin, proved that it's never too late to change, never too late to love and be loved. He chose his daughter over power, chose love over money, and in the end he left in peace, surrounded by the ones he loved most. And Vittorio, a Mafia boss who seemed to have no heart, learned that real strength doesn't live in causing fear, but in protecting those weaker than you. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness hold the power to change someone's life, and in doing so, change the person who offers them. This story reminds us that in real life, no one is perfect. All of us carry mistakes, sins, regrets, but what matters is what we choose to do with what remains of our lives. We can choose love, choose forgiveness, choose to protect those who need protecting, and as FIAM taught us, true loyalty doesn't need words. It shows itself through action, through presence, through staying beside the people we love in their hardest moments. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. I'd really like to know how you feel about it. Have you ever met someone like Vittorio? Someone who seemed cold but actually had a warm heart? Have you ever witnessed unconditional loyalty like FIAM gave Enzo? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear the stories that come from deep in your hearts. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video with the people you love. Every subscription, every like, every share is a huge motivation for us to keep bringing you moving and meaningful stories like this every day. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Remember to love the people around you, because we never know what tomorrow will bring. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.